Welcome back to Stories in the Inglenook, Part 2 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, read from the Usborne Complete Dickens, All the Novels Retold. It happened one morning that Mr. Gamfield, a hard-hearted chimney sweep, saw the notice. He grinned with glee. He could just do with £5, and the boy might come in handy. "I can give 'em a respectable chimney sweeping trade," he told the board. "It's a nasty trade," remarked one of the gentlemen. "Boys are smothered to death when sent up chimneys to clean them." "Yes," agreed another. "You can only have £3.10. Oliver was fetched. "Be thankful, Oliver. You're being made an apprentice," Mr. Bumble told him. "It'll set you up in life and make a man of you, although it will cost the parish £3.10, all for a naughty orphan which nobody can love." Oliver stared at him with tears rolling down his face. Ordering him to look happy, Mr. Bumble presented Oliver to the magistrate, who was to sign the papers to apprentice him to the chimney sweep. "Want to be a chimney sweep, do you?" he asked. "He said he'll run away if we try to stop him," Mr. Bumble answered for him, pinching Oliver to keep him quiet. "And his master is an honest man, who will feed and clothe him?" the old magistrate asked, peering at Mr. Gamfield, who could not have looked less honest if he tried. The elderly magistrate was just looking for the inkpot to sign the papers when his gaze rested on the pale and terrified face of Oliver Twist. "My dear boy," he said, "what is the matter?" Oliver fell on his knees and begged to be put back into the dark room and beaten, rather than sent away with that dreadful man. The magistrate said, "I refuse to sign. Take this boy back to the workhouse and treat him kindly. He seems to want it." Oliver was taken back to the workhouse by a fuming beadle, and the notice was pasted back on the door. The board was on the verge of shipping Oliver off to sea as a cabin boy when Mr. Bumble saw the undertaker, Mr. Sowerberry, reading the notice on the gate. He had a friendly chat with him. And that very evening, Oliver went to work at the coffin maker's, having been informed that if he refused, he'd be sent to sea to be drowned. As Mr. Bumble led him there, he was outraged to see Oliver crying again. "Of all the ungratefullest," he began. No, sir," Oliver wept, clinging to his hand. It's only—" "Only what?" Mr. Bumble asked in amazement. "Only that I'm so very lonely," Oliver cried. Mr. Bumble shook his head in wonder and led him on his way. "So this is the boy?" said Mr. Sowerberry when they arrived. "He's very small," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "Get downstairs, you bag of bones." And she pushed Oliver down into the dark kitchen where a servant girl was working. "Charlotte, give him some bits we put outside for the dog." Oliver's eyes glistened at the thought of meat, and he sat down to eat the meager leftover scraps with relish. "You don't mind sleeping among the coffins, do you?" Mrs. Sowerberry said when he had finished. Oliver dared not say no, and meekly followed. Oliver was all of a tremble that night, sleeping on a mattress under the counter with half-made coffins all around him. Without a friend in the world, he wished he were lying in his own coffin, with the grass swishing gently above his head to soothe him. He was awoken the next morning by someone else kicking the shop door open. "Open up, will you?" came a voice. Oliver scrambled up and unlocked the door to find a very large-headed, small-eyed boy, not much older than himself, sitting on the curb eating a slice of bread and butter. "I beg your pardon, sir," Oliver said. "Did you want a coffin?" The boy looked monstrously fierce, and said Oliver would need one himself before long if he carried on that way. "I'm Mr. Noah Claypole," he said importantly, "and you're lower than me. Take down the shutters, you lazy ruffian." Oliver did as he was told, staggering under the weight of the shutters, until Charlotte called them in for breakfast. "I've saved a bit of bacon from the master's breakfast for you, Noah," she giggled. "And there's some scraps for you," she said to Oliver. "Hurry, for they want you to mind the shop in a minute." "Hear that, houseboy?" Noah said. "Let him alone." Charlotte laughed. But there was little chance of that. Noah Claypole was a cut above an orphan, and meant to show it. The shop boys in the street looked down on him because he was poorer than them, but now Noah could get his own back by looking down on Oliver. What a beautiful thing human nature is. Because of Oliver's sweet, sad expression, Mr. Sowerberry decided to use him to lead funeral processions through the streets. He looked so much the part, dressed in a mourning suit, that all the mothers in town wept to see him. But Noah Claypole's jealousy was roused by seeing the new boy promoted, and he treated Oliver worse than ever. One day, after Noah had twisted Oliver's ears, pulled his hair, and called him a sneak, and still not managed to make him cry, he got personal. "How's your mother?" he taunted. "She's dead," said Oliver. "Don't say anything about her." Oliver's face flushed as he said this, and Noah thought with glee that he was on the right track. "What did she die of?" "A broken heart," replied Oliver, a tear sliding down his cheek. "Ha! Your mother was a right bad 'un," Noah said triumphantly. "What did you say?" Oliver said. "It's better she died, or she'd have been hung a criminal." Crimson with fury, Oliver turned over the table, grabbed Noah by the throat, and shook him until his teeth chattered. Then, with all his force, knocked him to the ground with one blow. A minute ago, he had looked quiet, mild, and dejected, but the insult to his mother had set his blood on fire. Chest heaving, eyes bright, he stood over his cowardly tormentor, glaring at him. "He'll murder me," blubbered Noah. "Help! He's gone mad!" Charlotte screamed, and Mrs. Sowerberry rushed down the stairs. They seized Oliver and dragged him, struggling and shouting, into the coal cellar. He was locked up, and proceeded to kick the door with such force that Mrs. Sowerberry exclaimed, "He'll murder us in our beds! Noah, go and fetch Mr. Bumble." Noah set off at a full speed, and found the beetle at once. "Oh, Mr. Bumble, sir, Oliver's turned vicious," Noah wailed. "He tried to murder me and the missus. The missus said, 'Will you come and flog him as the master's out?'" When they got back to the undertaker's, Oliver was still kicking at the cellar door. Mr. Bumble said in his deepest and most impressive voice, "Oliver, do you know this voice?" "Yes, let me out," Oliver shouted. Mr. Bumble was shocked. He drew himself up to his full height and looked around at the others. "This is what comes," he said, "of feeding him meat. You should have kept him on gruel." Mrs. Sowerberry sighed. "Oh, that's what I get for being too kind." "The only thing that can be done now is to leave him in there and starve him for a few days," said Mr. Bumble. At this point, Mr. Sowerberry returned home. Having heard an exaggerated account of what had happened from his wife, he dragged Oliver out by the collar, saying, "You're a bad fellow." "He called my mother names," Oliver explained. "What if he did, you ungrateful wretch?" said Mrs. Sowerberry. "She deserved what he said, And worse." "She didn't," said Oliver. "She did," said Mrs. Sowerberry, bursting into a flood of tears. Mr. Sowerberry beat Oliver and sent him to bed. Alone in the dismal workshop, Oliver's pride gave way to his true feelings, and he wept bitterly. In the first light of dawn, Oliver opened the workshop door, crept out into the sleeping street, and began walking. He walked and walked until he saw a sign that said it was 70 miles to London. London! In such a big place as that, Mr. Bumble would never find him. Sleeping in fields and begging for water and bread, Oliver walked until he could hardly stumble along. On the 7th morning, he limped into a town just north of London and sat in the pale sunrise on a doorstep, nursing his bleeding feet. A boy came swaggering down the road. He was the strangest boy Oliver had ever seen. He was about the same age as he was, but acted like a little adult. He wore a man's coat, which nearly reached his heels. The cuffs were turned halfway up his sleeves so he could get his hands out, which he thrust into his pockets. He had a hat perched on his head that looked as if it was about to fall off. "Hullo, my covey, what's the row?" he said to Oliver. "I've been walking 7 days, and I'm hungry and tired," Oliver said with tears in his eyes. "7 days!" the young gentleman exclaimed. "Running from the beak?" Seeing Oliver's look of surprise, he added, "My, how green! I suppose you don't know what a beak is?" Oliver replied that he thought it was the mouth of a bird. "Why, beak's a magistrate in a court of law. But come, you want grub, and you shall have it." He took Oliver to a shop and bought him a loaf and some ham. "Going to London?" he asked when Oliver had eaten. Oliver nodded. "Do you live there?" "When I'm at home," replied the boy. "Need a place to stay?" "I do indeed," said Oliver. "Don't fret," said the boy. "I know a respectable old gent there what'll give you lodgings for nothink, and never ask for change." The offer was too good to be refused. After chatting some more, Oliver found out that the boy's name was Jack Dawkins, but everyone called him the Artful Dodger. The Artful Dodger objected to being seen in London before nightfall. So it was 11 o'clock by the time they got there. The Dodger led Oliver through a maze of narrow, smelly, filthy streets. Children squalled and women shrieked, and dark figures lurked in doorways. Oliver was just wondering whether to run away when the Dodger ducked into a doorway, pulling him after. "Password," called a voice. "Brummy and Slam," was the Dodger's reply. And in 2 more minutes, Oliver was being ushered into a small firelit room where a villainous-looking, greasy old gentleman stood over a frying pan full of sausages. There was a number of boys there, too, no older than the Dodger, but smoking clay pipes like middle-aged men. "Got a new pal," the Artful Dodger said to the old gentleman. "Fagin, meet Oliver Twist." Fagin grinned and bowed low to Oliver. All the other boys came and shook his hand. They hung up his cap and emptied his pockets for him too, until Fagin chased them away with a toasting fork. Fagin gave them supper at the table. Oliver was so tired that it wasn't long before his head began to nod. He felt himself carried onto a sacking mattress on the floor and sank into a deep sleep. It was late the next morning when Oliver woke. He lay in his sleepy daze. The room was empty apart from Fagin, who was making coffee in a saucepan. Oliver watched as the old gentleman locked the door, then lifted a loose floorboard and drew out a box. His eyes glistened as he looked inside it. "Those clever dogs," he murmured, taking out a gold watch sparkling with diamonds. Then out came rings, bracelets, and other costly things. He rubbed his hands together in glee, and then he caught sight of Oliver. He slammed the box shut, seized a bread knife off the table, and leapt to his feet. "What are you watching for?" "I'm sorry if I disturbed you," Oliver said, terrified. Fagin seemed to gather himself and toyed with the knife before laying it down, as if he had only meant it as a joke. "Of course, my dear boy. Did you see the pretty things?" "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. "Ah!" The old man turned pale. "They're mine, Oliver. Mine. All I have to live on in my old age." Oliver said nothing. "Bring that pitcher of water here, my good boy," said Fagin, "and I'll give you a bowl to wash in." By the time Oliver had done as he asked, the box was gone. Before long, the artful Dodger returned with one of the boys from the previous night, Charlie Bates. The Dodger had brought hot rolls for breakfast, carrying them conveniently inside his hat. "Got anything else from your morning's work?" Fagin asked. "Wipes," said Charlie Bates, pulling out 4 beautiful silk handkerchiefs from his ample pockets. "Nicely made. Good workman, ain't he?" he said to Oliver. Oliver agreed earnestly, and they all burst out laughing. "You'd like to be able to make pocket handkerchiefs as well as Charlie Bates, wouldn't you?" Fagin asked him. "Very much indeed, if you'll teach me," said Oliver, and Charlie Bates laughed so much he choked on his coffee. After breakfast, the old gentleman and the 2 boys played a curious game which worked like this. The gentleman would put a wallet in one pocket, a handkerchief in the other, and a pocket watch in his waistcoat. Then he would stroll around the room, and the boys would dart behind him and slip the things out of his pockets with astonishing deftness. If Fagin felt them take anything, he would call out, and they would begin all over again. It looked such fun that Oliver begged to be able to try. Soon enough, he was able to slip a silk handkerchief out of Fagin's pocket without him feeling a thing. "You're a clever boy, and will make a great man one day," Fagin said, giving him a shilling. Oliver wondered what picking pockets could have to do with him being a great man, but thought the gentleman must know best. For 10 days, Oliver stayed inside, playing the game with Fagin, while the other boys went out to work. In the end, eager to earn his keep, he asked to be able to go to work with them. Fagin agreed, and sent him out with the Dodger and Charlie Bates. The 3 boys sallied out, the Dodger with his hat cocked, and Charlie Bates with his hands in his pockets, and Oliver between them, wondering where they were going. They turned a corner, and Dodger stopped and whispered, "See that old cove?" Oliver looked and saw an old gentleman dressed in a bottle green coat and smart white trousers, with gold spectacles and a cane under his arm. He had his nose in a book outside a bookstall. "He'll do," said the Dodger. Oliver looked on in surprise as the 2 other boys slunk behind the gentleman. He watched in horror as the Dodger slipped his hand into the gentleman's pocket and drew out a handkerchief, which he handed to Charlie Bates. Then they both ran away around a corner at top speed. In an instant, Oliver understood what all the business with the handkerchiefs had meant. He stood rooted to the spot with shock. Then, terribly frightened, he took to his heels down the street. At that very moment, the old gentleman turned, finding his handkerchief missing, and saw him. "Stop, thief!" he shouted. There was magic in the sound. The butcher threw down his tray, the baker his basket, and the errand boy his parcels, and after the thief they ran, helter-skelter. Dogs joined the chase, and they all hurtled down the street after the poor, pale, wide-eyed boy. Oliver was stopped at last as someone knocked him down. He lay on the pavement as the crowd gathered around him. "Stand aside! Give him some air! He don't deserve it, little devil! Make room for the gentleman! Is this the boy, sir?" "Yes." But when the old gentleman saw Oliver lying there, covered in dust with a bleeding lip, he said, "Poor little fellow." A police officer bowled up and pulled Oliver up by his collar. "Don't hurt him," said the old gentleman. "It wasn't me. It was the other two boys," said Oliver. "Likely story, you little devil," said the policeman, and dragged him off down the street, followed by the anxious old gentleman. The policeman dragged Oliver in front of a magistrate, who asked what had happened. Oliver, deathly pale, couldn't answer. He felt clammy, and the room began to spin round and round. "Hardened criminal, this one," said the policeman. "I think I'd rather not press charges. I'm not sure it was him after all," said the old gentleman. Then he murmured to himself, "There's something in his face that reminds me of someone." Oliver fell to the floor in a dead faint. "He's pretending," said the magistrate. 3 months' hard labour I'll give him." Just then the bookstall owner burst in, saying he had seen it all. "It was 2 other boys. This one stood by looking amazed." And so, to the policeman and the magistrate's dismay, Oliver was off the hook. He didn't know it, as he was still unconscious. The old gentleman bent over him. Oliver was still very pale, and his whole body was trembling. "Poor, poor boy," said the gentleman. He called for a coach and horses, and took the child home to care for him. It was several days before Oliver awoke. He had suffered from a terrible fever, and had been in danger of dying. He awoke on a snow-white pillow in a large, comfortable bedroom. "Where am I?" he wondered aloud, and a motherly lady came hurrying in. "Hush, my dear," she said softly. "You've been very ill." She brushed Oliver's hair back from his forehead with such kindness that he placed his little hand in hers and drew it around his neck. "What a sweet dear," the lady said with tears in her eyes. "Your mother must be proud." "Heaven is a long way off, but perhaps she can see me," Oliver said innocently. "She always looks happy when I dream of her." It was all the lady could do not to dissolve into tears. She plumped Oliver's pillows and fed him broth, and after he had swallowed the last drop, the old gentleman came in to see him. His name was Mr. Brownlow, and the kind lady was his housekeeper. "So, young man, what is your name?" Mr. Brownlow asked. "Oliver Twist, sir, and I'd like to thank you ever so much." But the old gentleman was looking in great astonishment at the painting on the wall above Oliver's head. "Good gracious, look! They are identical!" He had finally realized what Oliver's face had reminded him of. The lady in the painting had the same blue eyes, the same mouth, and in that moment, the expression too. Oliver was like a living copy of the lady in the painting. The Dodger and his friend Master Bates had joined in the chase and cry of "Stop, thief!" to cover their own tracks. Now, after winding their way through a maze of narrow streets, they stopped for breath under a dark archway. Oh, Charlie Bates burst into fits of laughter. "What a sight! Him running off with us, shouting, 'Stop, thief!' And all the while, I had the wipe in my pocket." "Tooraloo and high cockalorum, what'll Fagin say?" the Dodger wondered, which put an end to Charlie Bates's mirth. Fagin was waiting for them as they trotted up the stairs. "Where's Oliver, you young hounds?" he said, scowling furiously. The young thieves looked at each other uneasily. and Fagin seized the artful Dodger by the collar and shook him. "The drops have got him. Let go of me," said Dodger, swinging himself out of his coat, which he left in Fagin's hands. Fagin grabbed a pot and hurled it at him. A deep voice growled, "What the blazes was that? Good job it didn't hit me. I'd have floored somebody." And in walked a stout barrel of a man. He was about 45, and as scowling and villainous looking as could be, with a dirty handkerchief around his neck, a stubbly, dirty beard, and a black eye. A white, shaggy, scar-faced dog skulked into the room at his heels. "Hush, Mr. Sikes," said Fagin, trembling. "Not so loud." "Less of your mustering. Get me a drink, and mind you don't poison it," Bill Sikes replied. It was said in jest, but if the speaker could have seen the evil leer on Fagin's face as he went to the cupboard, he might not have thought the warning so unnecessary. Over the drink, Fagin told him about Oliver. "I'm afraid," he finished, "he might say something which will get us in trouble." "Very likely," Sikes grinned maliciously. "Well, if the game's up with us, it might be even worse for you," Fagin added, watching him closely. "Someone might tell on you." That got Sikes' attention. "Then we need to find out what's been done at the police station and get him back," said Sikes. They sat and looked at each other. Neither of them liked going anywhere near the police, so each was unwilling to volunteer. But the sudden entrance of a young lady, Nancy, changed things. She sauntered over, sat down at the table, and poured herself a drink. "You'll go, Nance, won't you?" Fagin wheedled. "She'll go," said Sikes, rather more threateningly. "No, she won't," bawled Nancy. However, after a few threats, promises, and bribes, she agreed. She tucked an apron on over her red dress and put on a bonnet. Fagin gave her a little basket to carry to look more respectable. "My poor little brother," Nancy play-acted, bursting into tears. "Oh, what has become of him? Oh, have pity, gentlemen." With a jaunty smile, she winked at them and disappeared out of the door. "She's a clever girl," Fagin remarked. "I wish they were all like her," agreed Sikes, pouring himself another drink. Nancy made her way to the police station and acted out her role to the officer there. "We haven't got the lad," the officer told her. "A gentleman took him home." Having learned the address Oliver had been taken to, Nancy returned to the thieves. "Well, at least that means he hasn't blabbed yet," Fagin said. "And if he means to, we might stop his windpipe before he can." This concludes the end of part 2 of the reading of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Please proceed to part 3. Thank you for listening.